Welcome to This Constitution. My name is Savannah Eccles Johnston.
And I'm Matthew Brogdon.
And today we're looking at confirmations again, but this time confirmations for judicial nominations. And this one is a completely different beast than executive nominations. Why require the advice and consent of the Senate for judicial confirmations? These aren't members of the president's cabinet. This is a third branch. Why is the Senate involved in this?
Well, you used the term quality control in the last episode we used, and you could double down on that here. There's quite a bit of debate in the Constitutional Convention about whether they ought to do this. And to be clear, it is required in the Constitution. Right. This is unlike with executive officers, where Congress can take some offices and make them, sort of absolve the Senate of the requirement to do confirmations. With all judges, the Constitution requires that the Senate confirm. President nominates, Senate confirms, gives its advice and consent. So the framers are making a deliberate choice to require this with judges. And it's interesting because there's a funny debate in the convention about this, because some people argue do you really need the Senate to participate in this? In fact, some people said, well, maybe the executive shouldn't be involved. Maybe we should just let Congress appoint the judges or let the Senate appoint the judges. So there's a lot of debate about this. But in the end, one thing that was very clear in that whole debate was that the whole point is just to make sure you don't get a bad egg on the bench.
Right, and the stakes are much higher here than for executive confirmations, because unlike what Smith from South Carolina wanted or whatever in the first Congress, executive nominees do not serve for life. But members of the judiciary do. They serve for life, and the only way to get rid of them is an extremely costly process of impeachment. And to make matters worse, you're appointing younger and younger judges these days, and the lifespan is increasing. So this is a costly quality control moment.
Yeah, the stakes are pretty high, which makes it surprising that early on, actually, the Senate didn't do a whole lot of work with confirmation. In fact, there would be sort of closed-door hearings in the 19th century to some extent. The first time that the Senate ever held a public hearing about a judicial nominee was actually for Justice Louis Brandeis in 1916.
Okay.
It's still one of the longest confirmation fights in our history. But Brandeis was controversial. He was a progressive. He was Jewish. It was 1916. But that was the very first time. There had never been a public hearing on a judicial nominee before that.
But he wasn't there in person.
Republic.
They didn't invite him in person.
No, the first person to show up in person is Stone, Harlan Fiske Stone, in 1925, so like 9 years later.
Wow. Stone
shows up in person to testify at a hearing, but that was a one-off. That didn't really happen again. That happens periodically. That doesn't become a regular practice until 1949, actually. Right. Eisenhower's appointees, starting with Clark, show up to testify at their own confirmation hearings. And that's been the universal practice ever since. So this whole circus of a nominee showing up to testify in front of a congressional committee, and the committee gets to grill them, is something we've done since 1949 and did not commonly do before that. So that's a relatively new practice.
Right.
No, we've been appointing judges since 1790.
Right.
But,
But now it's very public. The question, to put this in context, of this checks and balances season is this a check on the judiciary, on the executive, or on both?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, in some sense, it's a check on the executive. If you win elections long enough, you get to control the composition of the bench. So, the biggest engine of change in American constitutional law, if you want to change the law, you change the judges.
Right.
That happens through judicial appointment in our system.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a sort of critical element. That means that if the president gets to do this by himself and Congress doesn't have a role, then the president's exercising that power. And in that sense, this is a check on the president's ability to shape the direction of the law by shaping who holds office. So it's clear how Senate confirmation is a check on the executive, prevents the executive from just putting in judges they like. But how is it a check on the judiciary, I guess?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be a massive check. It's a one-time kind of gut reaction check on a yes or no, kind of controlling what the judiciary will look like. I think this is interesting because I do ask them a lot of questions about precedent, about the role of the Supreme Court in policy creation. So it does feel like something of a safeguard for legislative powers from judicial hands. But again, it's just a confirmation hearing. You have no control over this person other than impeachment.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those weird things. This actually happened at the Constitutional Convention because people kept talking about, appointment, and they were talking about who should appoint judges. Different delegates kept talking about it in terms of controlling judges. And actually, there's this really sort of hilarious set of exchanges with Ben Franklin, where he kind of points out to the delegates, like, this is not what appointment or confirmation are for. You can't control someone by appointing them. Right. You can only control someone if you can fire them. So impeachment is a real control, and we'll talk about impeachment later. So impeachment, very clearly, a check on the judiciary. The confirmation process is a little bit of a check in the sense you can prevent certain people from getting in, but you really can't exert any control over what anyone does in office subsequently through the confirmation power. So in that sense, it's kind of weak sauce and really is, I think, principally aimed at the executive, make sure the executive's not sort of doing this unilaterally or using this to exercise undue influence.
But this does get to the heart of something that I think nags at both the executive and the legislature about the judiciary, and that is you really can't control them. They serve for life. Once they're appointed, these are unelected gods on Mount Olympus. They could kind of do a lot of things, and you can't punish them a whole lot outside of impeachment. And in a democratic system, there is something both necessary and kind of jarring about that.
Yeah, I mean, the framers used the term independence, independent judges and independent judiciary, although it's true to say we have extraordinarily independent judges, but the courts as a whole, the institution of the judiciary, actually is subject to some control and oversight. Yeah. So, I mean, Congress can constrain what courts can do, can starve them of resources and constrain the way they function and do other such things. But the individual judges themselves are extraordinarily independent. So we have highly independent judges in a fairly independent judiciary. Right. I think.
Well, and to give another example of kind of fairly independent, the number of judges on the Supreme Court is completely up to Congress. It's fluctuated throughout our history, and the very existence of the appeals and district courts is up to the creation of Congress. Only the Supreme Court has to exist. So you're right, there is kind of this interesting tension between very independent judges. I
mean, mostly, anytime Congress gets really carried away, it is important that there's usually a very powerful argument on the other side of somebody going, hold on a minute, you can't go that far. So technically, Congress would say, we can do what we want. We can get rid of courts. We can make them as big as we want, as small as we want. We can take their jurisdiction away. In practice, there's some powerful arguments on the other side, and those usually prevail to keep Congress from doing everything it would like to do to sort of scale that back.
Well, and to allow the judiciary to remain a co-equal and competitive branch of government.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked about, when we talked about executive confirmations, we talked about these things sort of getting drawn out, and lengthy confirmation processes are a very recent thing for executive confirmations. They're also a pretty recent thing for judicial confirmations, especially with Supreme Court justices. So I've got some, I know these usually surprise people, the numbers on this sort of stuff.
Let's hear it.
And we'll just confine ourselves to the 20th century, like since 1900. Okay. So this is not even getting back into ancient history in the early republic, but just since 1900, right? There's, we've had like 40, I guess this would now be, 47 successful confirmations. Okay. So 47 Supreme Court justices have been successfully confirmed. Out of those, in terms of the time it took, 3 of them were confirmed in 1 day or less.
Wow.
That is on the same day
That's
that
amazing.
The president nominated them. the Senate confirmed them. So that's exceptional and important. Well, it's not exceptional. It's important because, of course, in President Trump's first term in office, when he appointed Amy Coney Barrett, she was quite famously confirmed in less than a month.
Right.
I think it was like 27 days or something like
right.
that. And at the time, in particular, Joe Biden, I remember at the time, actually said, this is unprecedented, that you would confirm someone this fast. And actually, that was a true statement for the roughly 40 years just before Barrett was confirmed. But for the rest of the 20th century, not exceptional at all. In fact, from 1900 up to 1981, up until Reagan's presidency, the median number of days it took to confirm a Supreme Court appointee was 17 days.
Wow. That's quick.
That was the norm. 17 days, 2.5 weeks from the time the president identified a nominee until the Senate confirmed them. So a very rapid process. And of course, we already pointed out, for some of that time, there weren't actually hearings. But even after we started hearings, it still tended to be pretty quick.
Right.
There was not this kind of like months-long hand-wringing over the nominee and sort of dragging it all out. Interestingly, there were 19 occasions where it took 10 days or less.
Well, let's explain what has to happen in those 10 days, because that's pretty quick for a turnaround. So not only do you have, once you start having public hearings, you have public hearings in the Judiciary Committee. And this is after you've had a president actually nominate someone, you've had the background checks, you've had the questionnaires submitted, you've had the ethics, you've had all the things. You finally got into a hearing. Then you get a committee vote, and then you need to get it on the executive calendar of the Senate. And then you have to get it until 2017 past the filibuster. Again, the 60-vote filibuster to even end debate and get a final vote on a Supreme Court justice. So the fact that they could do this in under 10 days is fairly impressive. Now, as of 2017, the filibuster has been lowered down, or cloture rules have been lowered down to simple majority. It's a nuclear option. So now, basically, a bare majority can confirm any Supreme Court justice. But still, these are lengthy processes that need to happen, which means that the Senate wasn't messing around. Well,
in some cases, there were no hearings. I mean, the three that happened on the same day are, of course, all members of Congress who were appointed to the court. And the Senate actually had an understanding, a sort of a norm, that if a member of the Senate was appointed to the federal bench, there would actually be no hearings. They'd just give them an up or down vote, because it was a courtesy afforded to their own members. So it's a really fascinating set of conventions operating there. Of course, this doesn't happen anymore because the whole idea that we would take cabinet secretaries or members of Congress and put them on the Supreme Court, not the way this works anymore.
Right.
Now we have a highly professionalized process. Unless you've served on an appellate court, in fact, unless you spent most of your career in the federal judiciary or in senior state courts, you probably stand no real chance of a Supreme Court appointment, certainly, but even federal court appointments are getting to be very sort of highly marked by this set of rigid qualifications.
Right. So you wouldn't have a Taft today becoming a justice on the Supreme Court.
Although don't get me off on Taft.
Oh, okay, sorry.
But I know it's a good point. Taft had been president. Making president a Supreme Court justice. He had been a federal judge before he was president, though.
Oh,
Taft started out his career as a federal judge, then left and went into executive politics, became Secretary of the Navy, and then vice president, and then president. He actually he was actually offered a Supreme Court appointment as an associate justice that he turned down because he wanted to be Chief Justice.
Wow, this guy did everything. He did all the things.
He did,
and
government. Most of them really quite competently. But being competent is not really a recommendation for being a great president.
Well, now I feel really bad because when I tell my students about Taft, I just say, remember the fat guy. That I feel like I really undermine his impressive qualifications.
He was a big man, but he wasn't like, he actually played golf every day whenever he was president.
Golf is not a sport. It doesn't count.
You know that?
It's not exercise.
Well, they didn't have golf carts then either.
Okay, fine.
Recall that you had to lug your clubs around 18 holes. So
All right. So back to this process. By the way, we mentioned why is it possible for Taft, even if he hadn't been on the federal judiciary, it doesn't actually matter. There are no qualifications for the Supreme Court listed out in the U.S. Constitution. Zero. Nothing. So
None.
I could be on the Supreme Court tomorrow, technically.
One of your children could be.
One of my children could be.
There are no age qualifications.
Right.
I sometimes tell students a president could nominate a minor from a foreign country to be a Supreme Court justice. And if the Senate's willing to confirm them, they shall be a member of the Supreme Court.
For life.
Right.
Well, but this brings us to actually a really important point, which is all of the qualifications for the judiciary, all the qualifications the Senate uses for this confirmation process are made up. We've come up with these qualifications. So they've really had to create a structure to decide who can and cannot handle this position.
Which contrasts with states, which tend to have qualifications, like Utah, where we are, has actually like a commission that it sort of studies the nominees, tells you if they're qualified. There's a whole
right.
process.
We don't do that at the national level, which begs the question: does politics then determine how the nomination process goes? And we have this idea that politics in the confirmation process is a new thing. It's not. Politics in the judicial nomination space has been there from the very beginning. See the midnight justices as an example. But just to give some numbers on this, the Senate rejected a full 1/3 of all Supreme Court nominees in the 19th century.
But did so quickly.
But
they didn't waste their time.
Right, but and then people will say, Bork was really the first partisan reject. No, you can see back in the 1930s, a nominee named Parker is rejected for his opposition at the time to increasing access for black citizens to vote. Between 1968 and 1972, 4 out of every 10 nominees was rejected. So by the time we get to Bork in the 1980s, we are well primed on kind of partisan fights. You mentioned Brandeis earlier. We're well primed for partisan fights over nominations. The real question is, has it changed? Is there something different today about the kind of questions being asked or the kind of divisions? It doesn't seem to be just purely Republican, Democrat. How is partisan politics involved today with confirming Supreme Court justices?
So, partisanship is pretty vividly on display in a lot of these things. People speculate about this. I don't think there's a consensus about why confirmation fights for judges have become more contentious. Because that's really what we're talking about. Senate's always rejected people for partisan reasons,
right.
But did they drag them out in public and have a 2-month debate about it and drag them through the mud and, were there millions spent on PR campaigns about it? And, one simple answer is that for any number of reasons, Supreme Court appointments just become more important.
Okay.
The stakes are a lot higher. Some of it's historical accident. When we think of contentious confirmation battles, we tend to think of confirmations of justices who are going to somehow shift what's happening on the court.
Right.
That's not always the case, right? When Ginsburg was appointed to the court, it was not terribly contentious. People didn't love the fact that she had been the ACLU's lawyer. That was pretty political. On the other hand, it wasn't really going to move the court significantly. It wasn't going to change in some, tectonic way constitutional law. So a lot of senators who didn't particularly like her still just voted yes.
Right.
I think Scalia was confirmed like 96-3 or something like that.
Right.
It was a massive. So it really matters. What matters for whether a particular confirmation battle is contentious is its consequences. What's at stake in that confirmation? And if there's not much at stake, nobody's going to expend tons of political capital fighting over somebody who's not going to change the way the law works. So you really, to know, you can't, so it's actually impossible to say, now judicial confirmations are so much more controversial than they used to be.
Right.
Well, which confirmation? Are we talking about Scalia? That actually wasn't controversial.
Right.
Are we talking about Merrick Garland, poor Merrick Garland.
The
never even got a
confirmation that never
hearing.
happened.
Right, the confirmation that never happened. So you really have to ask which one. What moment are we living in? And I find the most compelling accounts actually come from, the folks who look at this in a historical lens and say, well, we can't really generalize too much about how this works because we have to consider the moment we're in.
Right.
The fact is, we have been in a political moment that quite peculiarly has involved a lot of confirmations that might shift the court. That's not usually the case. Most replacements of judges in American history don't involve potentially changing the way constitutional law works because of one person getting confirmed.
We should speak to this point. What is it about a change in constitutional law? That's a new thing. It's a fight over judicial philosophy. Maybe that is new. I'm not sure if it is, but I've heard arguments that what is new isn't partisanship, it's the rift in judicial philosophy. It's the rift in how to interpret the U.S. Constitution, and therefore those big swings really matter. Because if you flip from 4-5 to 5-4 the other direction, you get to reinterpret the U.S. Constitution. What do you say to that? Are you convinced by that judicial philosophy is really more starkly divided than it was, for example, with Brandeis?
I mean, there clearly were things at stake with Brandeis. It would be weird to point to the progressive era and say, it was nice back then before we,
when
fought
everyone got
over
along.
judicial philosophy.
Yeah.
That was the Lochner era when,
Right.
half the judges in the country were pointing the finger at the other half the judges in the country and saying, you're legislating laissez-faire economics from the bench.
Right.
And the other half are pointing at them and going, yeah, but that's what the Constitution says. So I don't think that's new. Certainly the sort of hyper-theorizing constitutional interpretation, where sort of camps of, sort of original understanding, originalism, and
The living constitutionalists.
living constitutionalism and different stripes of it. We even have living originalism. We have, there's a whole, a whole set of different approaches that try to really give scholarly rigor and methodological rigor to how we interpret these things. That's somewhat new, but we have always fought over jurisprudence. I actually like the term jurisprudence, which means what's the mode of interpretation? What are the judicial reasons you use to reach a result and understand what the law means in a particular case? That's jurisprudence. We've always had massive divides over jurisprudence. On the Taney Court, it was, should we employ the jurisprudence of the court to read the assumptions of slaveholders into the text of the Constitution?
Right.
Or should we read the Constitution in the light of the Declaration of Independence, which seems to be, hostile to slavery? That was a serious jurisprudential debate. We didn't have law professors giving it labels, and writing law review articles on it, but that was a serious jurisprudential debate. And putting a justice on the court with one predisposition or the other would matter. I think the other thing that has happened with the sort of nasty confirmation battles is just the fact that they're public.
Right.
And the fact that we're sort of fighting over the intricacies of constitutional law, right? Especially the whole thing about precedent, right? For a long time in American judicial confirmations and in American judicial politics, the question was, would you adhere to precedent? And that meant, would you keep Roe versus Wade around? Now that's always been a serious contention, right? It boils down to the question, like, if the court gets something wrong, or you think the court got something wrong, how willing should the court be to go back and fix its mistake, assuming the mistake is of long standing and lots of people have relied on it since then? This has just always been a core debate about how constitutional law should work with a written constitution. But it's when that seeming methodological question becomes a proxy for what the real dispute is. Mm-hmm. Should we keep abortion rights or not?
Right. So what we're coming to here is we haven't gotten more partisan in terms of Supreme Court nominations. not even is it that judicial philosophy has gotten more contentious. We've always had divisions on how to interpret the U.S. Constitution. It's that now it's public and it's used as a proxy for bigger policy debates. Mm-hmm. And the hearing process, the very public nature, the very theatrical nature of the hearing process has simply exacerbated this. That's what's new in this moment. And of course, that we've had some key confirmations that will swing balances on the court. Mm-hmm. That's what's new. Which brings us to a second question, which is, in a perfect world, Matthew's in charge. What should the Senate Judiciary Committee be looking for when it's deciding how to confirm Supreme Court justices? Because again, there's no rules in the U.S. Constitution. So do we just lean into, we'll fight over how to interpret the Constitution, have the partisan fights, that's the whole point? Or is there some other standard that we should be looking at?
I would get rid of public hearings in a hot minute.
Agreed.
Public confirmation hearings are just not helpful. Now, there are people who disagree about that. But I think the public aspect of it is the most time-consuming, the most contentious, and the least productive of it all. So I think that would be one. Another, the process is highly individualized. Like what a particular senator sees as being sort of the essential criteria for whether they're going to vote yes or no on a nominee. I don't think we need to, settle that or have some sort of norm to tell senators, here's the set of criteria you should use. I think getting to an up or down vote more quickly, or letting the president know this is not going to come to a vote. Your nominee's sunk. There's not enough support. Throw in the towel and nominate somebody else, I think would be quite productive. So I think I've been encouraged by the fact the last two appointees we've had have had rapid confirmations. I don't think it hurt our knowledge of the nominees any. I think giving us another month or two to hear objections to them would not have improved our knowledge of them. It would have meant they would have joined the bench with more baggage. So I want confirmations with less baggage.
Right. Another thing to note is that both these nominees have been very young. So another new strategy here. Young nominees, neither of them changed the swing on the court, but both were potentially very contentious for the way they interpret the U.S. Constitution, but it didn't play out in hearings again because it isn't that big swing.
I mean, there'd be one surefire way of making confirmations less contentious, and that would be to make the Supreme Court less important.
Do you do that via term limits? How on earth do you do that?
You know what? The most creative way, well, you could do it a couple of different ways. One would be you could just make the court really busy. People think, oh, maybe we should, take jurisdiction away from the court, right? Keep the court from hearing certain cases. Actually, you know what? The best way to enfeeble the court would be to pass a bill with just a ton of mandatory jurisdiction in it. Like make it so that the court had to decide 500 cases a year. Its appetite for controversy would go way down.
Right.
Right? We just don't have time right now for this.
Right.
We're not going to wade into new issues. We don't want more stuff on our docket. So that's one. Actually, another one, when the whole thing with Garland was going on, there was one proposal, I want to say it came from like Randy Barnett or somebody, in the middle of all that stuff, and they said, you know what Congress maybe should think about doing? Instead of filling Scalia's seat, because Scalia died suddenly, and Obama's trying to fill it with Garland, said, just reduce the size of the court to 8.
Oh, well, there's a very different answer than you get these days.
Reduce the court to 8 or even 6. Give it an even number and fewer justices. They'll A, be busier, and B, it means they'll need a supermajority to do anything controversial. No more 5-4s. By definition, you'd have to have,
right?
6-2, basically, in order to do anything all that controversial. Have the court evenly divided number. Now that means the court's going to be hung a lot of the time. You get 4-4 splits. Awesome. That means the court can't act. And that just means when the court has uncertainty and close division, like Congress, it just won't be able to move forward. And so this was a weird way of indicating there are ways to make the court less crucially important to American politics, even while it remains critical in American law.
Right.
So, not bad solutions, actually.
Delightfully contrarian, actually, for how
Yeah,
to rein
I
in the
do
court.
think, I will say, you mentioned judicial term limits. Reducing the amount of time that justices are on the court, which means reducing the number of appointments that are made or giving them more regularity, like this idea of giving them 18-year term limits so we have a new justice every 2 years.
Right.
Sort of rotation like we have in the Senate.
Right. This was Biden's idea.
I think it will tie the court more closely to elections. It'll be clear that the consequence of every election will be 2 appointments to the court. I don't think that's going to lower the stakes at all on confirmations. It'll raise them. It'll make them. It won't make them less consequential. It'll probably make them more consequential,
Agreed.
and it will make them. It will tie them more tightly to electoral outcomes. It will tie the outcome of an election consistently, tightly to who gets onto the court. Now, you might think it's a good idea. If you actually want the court to be more reflective of democratic outcomes, great idea. I will point out one more contrarian view, which is if you want to do that, if you want to make sure that everybody who wins a presidential election gets 2 appointments to the court because there's a vacancy every 2 years. I think the easiest way to do that is just get rid of Senate confirmation. Own up to what you're doing and saying, if you win the presidency, you get to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices. And get rid of Senate confirmation.
You mean amend the Constitution, get rid of Senate
you'd have to
confirmation?
amend the Constitution
Okay.
to do this. Well, you'd have to amend it anyway
good point,
to
good point.
adopt the term limits. But I think
Wow.
part of that would have to be you get rid of confirmations for Supreme Court appointees precisely because as long as the Senate has the confirmation power, it has the power to be
Right.
obstinate, to do nothing. And what if
Right.
they do nothing?
Right.
And then they delay the appointment, and then you've thrown off the whole schedule. So you could do this very simply, and I think people should own up to this whole idea of having term limits and regular appointments and the other things is just actually insisting that the court should follow the election returns more closely.
And ought to be political.
And ought to be political, yes.
Right.
And so
Right.
then if that's the case, make it political.
Yeah, and at that point, you've lost me, which takes us back to, I like that the Senate is a check on both the executive power over the judiciary and some very tentative small power on the judiciary itself.
Agreed.
There's a useful role to be played by a robust and independent court that is strongly checked by its 2 co-equal branches.
Agreed.